Well, I mean, that's the fastest way to get an American or a Westerner generally to stop talking about how special and how unique they are. Just bring up colonization, bring up slavery, bring up exploitation and violence, and suddenly they'll abandon their exceptionalism. You know, they'll say, "Oh, everybody did that." Suddenly, they're not unique. When you talk about their crimes, then they're not unique. They want to make their evil banal. They want to pretend that every civilization acted the same way that they do, and that every civilization will always act the same way that they do. So they trivialize and minimize their evil as commonplace. And the irony is that then they say that the genuinely unique thing about them is their virtuousness and their respect for human rights and justice and fairness and all that. The same person who just shrugged off colonization, you know, who just shrugged off slavery and violent subjugation. But of course, they've got it backwards. The violence and the domination and the cruelty are absolutely the most unique and the most distinguishing features of their so-called civilization. And their virtues are actually their mediocrities. They haven't innovated or advanced in values or principles or ethics at all. They haven't improved in these fields whatsoever, certainly not upon previous civilizations. But in brutality and oppression and corruption, they really have excelled. That's where they truly stand out. It's important to actually point this out because otherwise, if you do not understand, for instance, how distinctly perverse their version of slavery was, for example, or how cruel their version of colonialism was, how savage they've been in warfare, then you'll have a distorted understanding of all of these things as they occurred throughout history by other civilizations. You know, whenever you see the word slavery, you'll think it means the identical version of slavery that was practiced by the West. Or when you read about an empire expanding, you will assume that it was done with as much brutality as Western colonization. And you'll think that, for instance, carpet bombing of civilians, you know, indiscriminate killing, wanton killing, is just standard practice. And nobody ever had actually rules of warfare that they followed. That's why when, for instance, when Iran retaliated against Israel, and they gave advanced warning and told them exactly where they were going to hit, and they carried it out casualty-free, you know, a series of precision airstrikes, it seems strange to people. Because you're used to Western shock and awe, surprise attack, wanton killing, and catastrophic large-scale death and destruction. That's what you're used to, and you think that that's normal. You know, a good example of how deceptive it is for the West to pretend that they're not unique in their barbarity is when I see people saying the Muslims colonized Africa the same way that the Western powers colonized Africa. You know, that I get that a lot. I mean, really? Islam spread across North Africa and East Africa and West Africa largely through trade and interaction. And that led to the creation of powerful indigenous independent kingdoms, regional empires and dynasties, centers of learning and commerce, created by African Muslims for the benefit of Africans. You know, one of the richest men in history was Mansa Musa, the ruler of the Empire of Mali, which included present-day Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Niger, Nigeria, Chad, and Mauritania. Massive territory, almost equivalent to the continental United States in square kilometers. All organized by Africans and ruled by Africans. So which land under Western colonization did the colonizers make richer? And which colonized country was a sovereign empire ruled exclusively by the indigenous people? It's an absurd comparison. You have the Mali Empire, the Ghana Empire, the Songhai, the Bornu, the Fulani Empire, the Sultanate of Zanzibar. The spread of Islam created kings. Western colonization created slaves. When Islam spread in Africa, literacy spread, education spread, trade and commerce spread, prosperity spread, development spread. And again, this was all done by African Muslims, not by outsiders, not by colonizers, by the indigenous people. Contrast that with the British and the French and the Dutch and their colonization, and then still tell me that the Muslims were colonizers. Well, the difference is night and day. They de-developed Africa. They plundered Africa. They subjugated and destroyed Africa. When I tell you that the countries of the Sahel were among the most developed and richest lands in the world, you can't believe it today. You see how things are now. The poverty, the lack of infrastructure, the violence, and the instability. Well, the only reason it's like that is Western colonization. Those lands, the Sahel, the lands of the Sahel, were the envy of the world. And you made them, according to Frantz Fanon, the wretched of the earth. We spread prosperity and you spread misery. We built and you tore down. We produced and you stole. Again, you can't try to say that your colonization spread through trade and missionary work. Again, that's what you're going to try and say. And that Islam also spread through trade and da'wah, which is like missionary work. And you can pretend that these are the same. That's because you're using trade, in your case, as a euphemism for plunder and theft. And the proof is in the poverty. Whereas in our case, it actually was trade, and the proof is in the prosperity. You call what you did missionary work, but it was coerced conversion, subjugation, and brainwashing to create compliant, self-loathing colonial subjects. Scholars of Islam and Sufis and traders traveled into Africa and interacted with the people and taught people, and people chose Islam. And then they built for themselves what they built for themselves. You know, you went there with a picture of a white Jesus who you told them was God, a God who very deliberately looked just like the man who was holding the picture and demanding their obedience. And then you wonder why we don't allow people to draw pictures of the prophets after what you all did with your Caucasian Jesus pictures all over Africa, just to make people worship you. No. When the Muslims went into Africa and went to the African countries, we just taught La ilaha illallah. There's no God but Allah. There's no God but God. And you have a direct relationship with Him. He's the only authority and He's the only one that you have to serve. And then we left. I don't know how you can dare to call that colonization. No. You are distinct. You are unique in how diabolical you have been and how diabolical you still are. And you always try to impose stupidity and confusion on people so that they can't properly detect what you're doing. That's what you always did, and that's what you still do today, or you try to do. And this whole thing is an example of that. Everybody was brutal. You know? No, they weren't. Muslims colonized. No, they didn't. All power is corrupt. No, it isn't. You're special in that. And the things that you pretend to be special in, you're very much not special in, like freedom, democracy, and human rights, and so on. The only special thing about you in this regard is the extent to which you do not have those things, but think you do. And the extent to which you think that no one else on earth has them. When the reality is, to whatever extent people outside the West don't have freedom and don't have human rights, it's more often than not because of the West that they don't. You know, it's just like your white Jesus pictures. What you mean by freedom and democracy and human rights is actually just you. Just like what you meant when you brought Christianity to Africa. It wasn't because you wanted them to have religion, no. You wanted them to have you. Because nobody's actually missing any of the things that you lie about bringing. But you have to make them feel like they are missing something. You have to make them feel that they're inadequate. That you have to make them feel that they need something and that you are that something. So they say you don't have freedom when you do. And they say you don't have human rights when you do. Because all they really mean is you don't have me and my ways and my domination and my supremacy. So you bring to those countries what you don't even have back home, freedom, democracy, and human rights. These words. You come actually empty-handed. But you tell them that you'll give them freedom and you'll give them human rights, and then you fill your empty hand with their resources. And then they have less freedom and less human rights than they had before you came. That's westernization. Less freedom, fewer rights, less wealth, and fewer resources. Because like I said, they don't even have those things back home. What they're telling you that you don't have and that they're going to give you. All these wonderful principles and freedoms and ideals, they don't have it back home. You already have it, but they try to make you feel inadequate and try to make you feel inferior so that they can convince you that you need them to save you from this imaginary lack that they have imposed on you. Just like they did with the white Jesus pictures. Because if you're going to rob someone blind, well, you have to blind them first. And that's all they're doing. When they try to tell you that no empire behaved differently than they do, they're trying to blind you. When they try to tell you that Muslims were colonizers, they're trying to blind you. They're trying to blind you to what they did wrong and to what we did right. And of course, they want to drive a wedge between Africa and the Muslim world, between Africa and the Middle East, and between Muslims and non-Muslims in Africa, because they know that solidarity between us would ruin all their plans. So they pretend, for example, that some Sudanese are Arabs and some are Africans. You know, they talk about Arabized Africans in Sudan. This is all part of trying to distort history and to try to impose a false narrative of Western-style colonization being perpetrated by the Muslims, which isn't something that ever happened. No, Sudanese are Africans. So-called Berbers are Africans. The Somalis are Africans. Nigerians are Africans. I mean, why is it that if they speak Arabic, that somehow makes them outsiders? But you don't call Africans who speak English or Africans who speak French or Afrikaans like they're outsiders. It's just the same old divide and rule tactic that you always use. And you're more desperate now than ever to try to prevent any African, Muslim, and non-Muslim solidarity. That's why you organize and train and arm and fund and back all of these militant jihadi groups in Africa, and everybody knows that you're the ones who are doing it. The French, the British, the Americans, everyone knows that these are your mercenaries, these so-called Islamic militants. Everyone knows that these are just your version of Wagner that you use to destabilize and control. You use their existence in Africa to justify your existence in Africa, which is the only reason why they have an existence in Africa. So that you can pretend that you're there to protect people. You can pretend that you're there to ensure security, but somehow you never make things better. You know, somehow in Niger, in Mali, and Burkina Faso, for example, they've been more effective against those groups, those militant groups, since they kicked you out. No, you're just an old dog with old tricks, but everybody's on to you now. Oh, you have a long and disgraceful history in Africa. There's no getting around that. And you've never changed. This is the problem with you. I'm telling you, everything that you did over the centuries to that continent and to its people, it's doomed you. I don't think that America or the West even have a future unless and until they can do right by Africa, but they won't. They just keep compounding the wrongs of the past. And that is another unique thing about the West. They truly have a complete immunity from learning or evolving or correcting their behavior. Well, I haven't seen people like that never change. That's a special quality that they have. They're absolutely committed to primitivity. They have an insurmountable aversion to developing and civilizing and maturing. All their high-sounding words about values and principles are just used to cover up the fact that they have never actually internalized any of those values, any of those principles. There's no substantive difference between a con man and a mugger, just a difference in style. And that's what you can say so-called Western civilization is. It's the same old barbarism that it always was, but camouflaged with a style that can fool genuinely civilized people into thinking that they're not just muggers. Because you learned that style from our substance. You learned what civilized, sophisticated, moral societies look like when you encountered the Muslim world. So then you ripped off our style so that you could make people believe that you also had the substance that goes along with the style, but you never did have the substance, and you still don't. You came to the global south, came to Africa with barbaric intentions. But you knew that the people were people who were civilized people. They were educated people, decent people. And if you had come with a style that actually reflected your barbaric intentions and your barbaric substance, well, they'd see you a mile away. So you mimicked the style that they were used to, the style of civilized, educated, decent people. That's as much as you have matured. That's as much as you have developed. When you set foot outside of Europe, you discover that there are people in the world who have honor and morality and sophistication. So you learned how to refine your hunting methods. That's all. You did nothing but refine your hunting methods. So no, don't be modest. You are special. You are overachievers. There truly haven't been any people quite like you before. That's a fact. Your so-called civilization is indeed unique in human history. Because if the rest of the world was anything like you, then human history would have ended a long time ago.